Delicate Subject, Chapter 18. Sleep sessions and interrogation sessions continued, but they lacked direction. Mo and Targ seemed to run out of things to ask, repeating themselves endlessly. They had no idea who Cairo Balak was. She vaguely considered turning in agents named after the 7 dwarves just to mix it up. Yes, Sneezy works in healthcare on Karshan and has a virus he's gonna unleash. But settled for silence and repetition and getting hit a lot. She couldn't afford a sense of humor or whimsy, and she began to realize why Thane's sense of humor was so muted. How a sense of humor, wanting to gloat or rebel, wanting to fuck with someone in retaliation, to underline their stupidity or her own cleverness, could trip up or give away her motives or inherent resistance. How humor had been squeezed out of Thane over a lifetime by design, denying him access to all avenues of defiance. She could scream. She could cry, and she did both, often now. But she knew that she could never be caught laughing inside these walls. She had not counted laughter as one of her luxuries, and now she always would if she got out of this bullshit. And then she remembered. She had to hope she wouldn't get out. She had no opportunity for escape. She was always restrained. All maintenance of her body, other than eating, was done while she was unconscious, and she had never broken through the drugs. Her body had healed. The cratered holes had filled in with good medical follow-up by Skitter. There wasn't a mark on her except for daily injection tracks that were also treated and invisible by the next day. There were marks on her face from attempted Batarian persuasion occasionally, but they'd also be gone each time she woke up. Vitkiev had to struggle through experience and creative horror, but she was only going through the motions, repeating the same reports, coming to the same conclusions, breaking off contact before Jane could pour a new flavor of searing pain into her spine. She was faking agonized screams, her hands already off Jane's skin. She even felt that Vitkiev was offering her support. The Asari had relived missions with her, Vermeer and Saren, anything that had already been publicized. But even if Jane was approaching pitying Vitkiev, she could not risk contact. If Jane was correct, Vitkiev wanted out, and couldn't get herself out, much less Jane. Vitkiev was trapped. It hung on her. Vitkiev did not know Thane's name, thought him to be Urim, did not know for sure that there was a Drell on the Normandy. She had identified Garrus, but their association was public knowledge. Vitkiev had come up with no new information, only reiterating that Jane was badass. They all knew that before she got here. Despite all of Jane's bravado, she could feel changes, insidious ones, and she began to believe the real purpose of her abduction was playing out. The only change when every other process went stagnant was in Skitter, who became kinder, more engaged with Jane as a person and not a duty. Just like with Vitkiev, it could all be explained with Skitter growing to admire Jane, sympathizing with her circumstances. It shouldn't necessarily be a source of suspicion, but because of Skitter's species, she couldn't help but be compared to Thane, reminding Jane of Pawn Eva and layers of deception. Jane had no real idea of how long she'd been in this room, forced, unconscious for unknown periods of time. unable to determine an interval or how often it happened. She couldn't count straight through. She got interrupted or forgot, and they varied. Probably 4 or 6 hours on average. Enough to get hungry and thirsty, enough to get tired, enough to have to go to the bathroom. She could wake up with all of those impulses worse, wake up to none of those, but a feeling of drunkenness or disorientation or fear or hallucination. She had no way to measure time, and she could only guess at the intervals that she was awake. Eventually, she labeled them forever. She counted, but didn't try to connect the counts to time anymore, only to the space between each breath. She woke up clean, restrained, and maintained with new injection sites. She started to feel a fuzziness of her thought process, a gradual slip of her coherence. Drug-induced, exhaustion-induced, too many influences to trace back what caused it. Inevitable and accelerating. Thane and Garrus's voices changed, and were occasionally forgotten as a resource at all. Now when they spoke, they urged her to return to the ship, and the cognitive dissonance forced her to resist thinking of them. Defiance and strategy were replaced with horror and helplessness. Solace from the outside world was gone, and survival here was measured in moments. Her thoughts turned inevitably to the resurgent, increasingly irresistible need to get back to the ship, the amorphous imperative to do it now. She occasionally had enough of a grasp on the consequences of that action that she'd be horrified. She'd scrabble for something she needed to remember, and then she'd forget that she needed to remember. And all that remained was the urgency to do something. She could not recall what it was, but she knew she would know what to do when there was an opportunity. Skitter's hands were always gloved, her eyes beginning to linger on Jane, the utilitarian feeding turning more gentle, resulting in a tentatively stroked cheek, an extra sip of water, her thumb wiping away a drop. Despite Jane's intellectual insistence on vigilance, intellect and insistence and vigilance all faded over time. They dulled and tarnished, like mirrors that no longer provided reflections. No insight, no reason to gaze there. Skitter was a comfort. Skitter was heart-rendingly reluctant, her face slowly transforming from the distasteful horror of looking at Jane's captivity into sympathy. Until at one point in the long continuum of her captivity, she whispered, "I'm sorry." She said it so quietly, Jane wasn't sure that Skitter knew she'd heard it. And then there was an injection that left Jane unconscious. Jane wanted to protect her, to take her out of here, to take her back to the Normandy where they would both be safe. Jane was released from her strapped dolly on occasion, only when paralytics were injected. She was wide awake but unable to move, chemical restraints replacing physical ones. Jane's muscles had atrophied, and Skitter moved her limbs and her joints gently, massaging tight and failing muscles, easing the muscle contractures developed from holding a forced position indefinitely. After the unabated restraint, it was bliss. Skidder whispered that she was sorry every time she refreshed the medication. She was strapped back in with reluctance from Skidder, horror or exhaustion from Jane, unable to maintain the energy for protest. Knowing she'd had the energy once for protest, and for suppressing protest, but now immersed in inescapable silence. Down in that well like a dead girl. It had been a common nightmare. Now it was counted among other nightmares with no waking and eventual dull acceptance. Skidder would leave with head and back bowed, terrified of Mo and Tark, avoiding Vitkiv entirely, as far away from her in the room as she could be before fleeing. It might have worked if the faces and body language of Mo, Tark, and Vitkiv had been as well disciplined as Skidder's. Stress and time were taking their tolls, and not just on Jane. Mo and Tark should have at least mocked Skidder, shoved her, abused her. But their eyes slid off the drill. Not in the way they would have if she were below their notice. Despite every opportunity, she was not a target of their abuse. She was a source of ill-concealed fear. It was the same with Vitkiv. She was unable to keep a contemptuous look on her face, and there was a cloud of fear over her consciousness if Skidder was in the room. Directly correlated. Sometimes a play could be destroyed by poor supporting actors. Jane noticed it idly, but didn't remember the real significance. Why it mattered. She had begun to accept instead of oppose by default. She hadn't the energy or the capacity other than in panicked, gasping breaths, experiencing sliding helplessness over and over. Until that had become such redundant information on its own, it was no longer catalogued. Jane's inhibitions were degraded, her energy gone, her control over her own body taken from her. She was kept paralyzed or unconscious for maintenance of staying alive, wakened to helplessly welcomed apology or apathetically endured abuse. She leaned to the apology, began to anticipate and treasure it as a bright point in her day. Skidder had a beautiful, soft voice, and it seemed more familiar and a little more seductive each time she heard it. Skidder was fragile, violet and peach tones to her skin. One day she felt bad about calling her Skidder. When this lovely woman tried to help her, did help her every day, relieved the cramp and the pain, and granted her an oasis. Jane asked quietly without thinking of asking, "What is your name?" Jane wasn't sure why she'd broken her silence. Muted panic did not surge. It blipped and fell. She was reassured by thinking that this poor woman deserved her own name. That was why she asked. It was still rebellion. It was comfort in a fellow prisoner, someone who would not get out of here alive. Just like Jane. This lovely young woman smiled with shy, flattered beam, squeezed Jane's heart. My name is Yalis. Jane smiled at her to encourage her and thank her. Yalis's face grew shadowed, and Jane wanted to comfort her. I am so very sorry, Jane. And gave her another injection. Jane smiled. Yalis knew her name. She said, It's all right, Yalis. Before she was gone again. Unmeasured time and unrecorded events passed. And one day when she woke, the room was empty and bleak because the light was gone and Yalis was gone, and Jane knew only to wait and listen. That everything else caused pain. She could wait with no effort, and she could listen without it hurting sometimes. So she did those things. She had to get Yalis out of here, somewhere safe, back to the ship. She waited. The Vakarian interrogations stopped, and there was only waiting now. Waiting for Yalis. Waiting to get back to her ship. She knew if she was good, she could go back, and although she could not always remember what good was, and she had flashes of horror and realization, they always slipped away. And good meant waiting. She told Yalis all about the ship and the people she'd meet, speaking with quiet voices and huddled confidences. Garrus was the name of someone she wanted to introduce to Yalis, to tell him about her and how much she'd helped. Thane was the name of someone who might be jealous of Yalis. Jane thought maybe he'd try to kill Yalis because that's what he did. She would not let that happen. She would keep Yalis safe, and they would do great things with the Normandy. She didn't know what great things, but she had faith. She had to have faith. She had the best ship and an amazing team, and she loved them. And Yalis promised to love them too, to help. Yalis was as beautiful as the Normandy was, and Yalis promised to put her bare foot on the deck, and that she would know, just like Jane did, how special she was. Everyone could know how special. Everyone could be that special. Jane didn't need to be injected anymore. There were no more apologies. Yalis helped Jane sit as she sweated and shook off addictions and tremors, wanting to make her proud. She helped by stretching, and without all the drugs in her system, she focused on rebuilding her body with Yalis's help. She needed to be strong. She listened as Yalis said, Jane, I am afraid. People here are cruel to me. Jane tried to remember other people, tried to remember or think why anybody would be cruel to Yalis. Tried to reassure her. I promise to protect you. Jane didn't know where she got the courage, but she reached out a hand to touch Yalis's lip, then drew her finger back, remembering herself and that she shouldn't do that. Yalis took off her gloves. Jane trembled, and Yalis leaned in and kissed her, melting and warm. There was a familiar racing of venom along her lips, and she knew the word venom, and she knew the word Drell, and she knew for a few horrified seconds that another Drell named Urim had different venom, and another Drell named Thane had venom that was exactly the same, and she remembered what that meant. She froze and trembled. And then Yalis' mouth on hers was all that mattered. And she could barely breathe from the joy and the promise. Yalis rarely left her now except to bring food and pills, water to drink, water to bathe her. Yalis whispered, with Jane cradled in her gracious arms. And Jane trembled and cried and answered questions, listened to instructions. She tried to remember everything, but there were different versions of things to remember, and she couldn't hold them all in her head at the same time. Needed Yalis to confirm which one was real when Jane spoke of doubts and crazy things. Yalis reminded her she'd been drugged, she'd been interrogated, she was weak and wasn't thinking clearly. But she needed to be clever and strong in order to escape. Jane had felt a surge of something at those words. Clever and strong. That's the person she could be now. She had been that. She could be that again. She reached for it, fought for it with everything she had. A Vakarian had entered the room. Yalis had said, "He hurt me. He hurt you, Jane." And now his body was on the floor. Jane barely remembered killing him. It wasn't important. He was gone now. Yalis had welcomed her into a grateful embrace with her gentle, sweet hand spreading joy and pleasure over her body. Jane could tremble and shake and have pain and doubts, but Yalis would bring her back to what was right and speak to Jane with her goddess voice, stroke her fingertips over her skin, and whisper soft words. "Protect me, Jane, and we can have everything together. You protect people. You will always protect me. I know it. Always." Jane was a protector. It's what she did, and she had never had more to lose than this fragile, beautiful woman who took care of her, braved what was outside the door, where Jane was afraid to go, brought her food, whispered to her, gave her courage, gave her the hope of escape. They were in this filthy room, not fitting for her joy to dwell. But Yalis had brought a blanket and a pillow, set it on the ledge they used to sleep, and whispered how much she loved Jane, as her fingers traced over her gently, creating soft cries and moans, her lips like flower petals with wet heat. Jane traced her reassuring, loving hands over Yalis' pleasure-splashed skin, the light cascading from her, sanctifying the room for her presence. Jane worshipped her with her tongue and her voice and her fingertips, every part of her. As Yalis closed her arms around Jane, stroked her hair, and was her only home. The Normandy wasn't good enough for Yalis. Yalis hadn't asked for the ship, only to be taken there, but if she wanted it, she could have it, and melt it into scrap if she wanted to. It was only giving the gift that mattered. Only Jane had the power to give that gift, and she would do everything she could do to make that happen. Jane woke up, disoriented, tangled in the arms of a female Drell, Tyramid still racing, horrified and wanting to chew off her own limbs where they touched her like a trapped animal, struggling briefly until the thing noticed her struggles, and tilted her head, lowered her mouth to Jane's, kissed her while Jane tried to struggle back but couldn't move. Jane, come back to me. Remember what I have told you. Flashes of a plan of knowing what indoctrination was lasted for the 7 seconds she knew she had, before the indoctrination with reinforcing venom caught up to her, clamped down on her, and brought paralysis and hesitation, freezing her muscles as Yalis' face drew back, watching her with pity and sympathy, but no doubt counted herself, watching the helpless transformation on Jane's face that had happened uncounted times, when her resistance broke through, when the drugs wore off, when suggestion failed. The only victory she had could be measured in those 7 seconds, never reducing to 6 or 5, no longer changing, no more ground to be gained or lost. Every iteration of trying to attack Yalis had already occurred to her, and she could not do them. She'd started trying to kill her when she'd been weaker, when Yalis could fend her off easily. And now Jane was stronger, but she couldn't make her mind remember it all in 7 seconds, what she'd done, what she had to do, before she'd freeze, after the same instincts to strike duplicated themselves and fell into the well of inaction. Jane clung to terrible hope. She wanted Yalis, despite herself, because of herself. She had wanted to kill the Vakarian. Maybe Yalis could only make her do what she wanted to do. Please. No. She had not wanted to tell Yalis everything. Everything. And she had. Forgive me. She reached for her approving voices. And then the names were gone. And Yalis' smile went from something she didn't know and couldn't name to her most beautiful smile. Every smile. Yalis stroked her hair. Lovely, Jane. I have done all I can do, and you have done all you can do. It is time to leave. I will get weaker if we do not, and I am weak compared to you. Yalis tucked Jane's hair behind her ear, watched her face for a moment with a sad smile. Would you like to leave here? Go with me to your ship? She is a beautiful ship. You've told me so much of her. That was all she was waiting for. Who she was waiting for. All her dreams and ambitions made whole, lightning rushing along her spine. Yes. Yalis stood and took her hand and opened the door Jane had never gone through. Jane shook and trembled, but Yalis said, Jane, if you remember what I have said, nothing will hurt you. I will not allow anybody to hurt you. Someone should protect you. I may not be able to, but I want to try. Their lips met in a kiss, and Jane felt the warming and courage-granting boost of venom, and the truth, the light that came with it. Yalis knelt by the corpse of the Vakarian, took a pistol from his side, and gave it to Jane. Jane should have thought of that. Yalis took his other pistol and kept it for herself, and with a cautioning, warning glance of dangers to come and an indication to be quiet, took Jane's hand and beckoned for her to step outside the door and into the new world they could make their own. Yalis guided her down a hallway and opened a door to the left. Inside was an Asari. Jane remembered her after a moment. Violet and gray, her mind searching and then turning to sympathy and comfort and fear. Vitkiv. She was tied up, helpless, upright and staring, horrified eyes, making muffled sounds like begging and warning, her attention on Jane. Yalis said, "She hurt me, Jane." Jane aimed the pistol and pulled the trigger, and a hole bloomed on Vitkiv's forehead. The pistol felt wrong. She thought about it and, in panic, remembered 2 different types of counting. Counting up and then only being able to count to 7. Vitkiv's body slumped, and the doubts and worries were gone. Yalis stepped over to Jane, drew her in a kiss that left her trembling. "Thank you, Jane. I knew you would protect me." Yalis took her hand, venom tingling through her fingertips, and led her toward her destination. They stepped over the body of another Vakarian, another insignificant thing that had hurt Yalis. Jane must have killed him earlier. She didn't remember. He had been dead a long time. Yalis got them into a shuttle and began the sequence to leave, as Jane sat, eyes closed, overwhelmed and shaken. "Jane, beloved, remember, you rescued me, you protected me. I will help on the Normandy as I helped you with these terrible people who hurt you, who hurt me. Take me to the medbay and stay with me there. Watch over me and wait for the great things we will do together. You must know how to contact the Normandy. I cannot find them without your help. Medbay." Yalis was injured, green blood dripping, her face battered. When had that happened? When had that happened? Jane panicked, and Yalis calmed her, assuring her that Jane had stopped the people that had hurt her while they were escaping. An Asari, a Vakarian. Yalis spoke softly until Jane remembered. Yalis reminded her about the Normandy, and Jane struggled to remember numbers, codes from before, thought of counting, and then remembered what Yalis needed, what they both needed, and gave her the emergency broadcast code that would relay their transmission to the Normandy and set a rendezvous point far from here. Jane complied with each request, notification, and authorization, and gave the right response. Yalis turned to her, took her hands in hers. "I am frightened, Jane. Stay with me when I am on the Normandy. Keep me with you, please. I am afraid people might try to hurt me. I need you to protect me." Jane's brows drew together. "Always. I will protect you. Always. They will be so happy to see you. I know they have been looking for you, dearest love, and now everyone will be together. We will do great things. We will do great things." They were going back to the ship, back home, with a woman she loved. We can't speak to them right now, though they will try. Our communications are limited. We will land on the ship, and you will introduce me. Keep me safe. Jane nodded, shaken with emotion and freedom and a bond she did not understand but embraced, as she had many odd things in her life. Everyone would see. The Normandy covered the majority of the distance to them. Jane struggled to remember who was on the ship, faces and names blurring, but it didn't matter. Garrus was brave, determined, piloting the shuttle, and Jane was so proud, though her head hurt and she had to lie down, Garrus encouraging her to do it. I will get us there. All you need to remember is that you protected me. You will protect me. You will keep me with you. Kiss me now, Jane, and kiss me when you wake. Jane leaned in and did as she was told, Garrus's fingers trembling on the side of her cheek. Then exhaustion that she did not understand overwhelmed her excitement, as she curled into a cold ball on the floor, hugged her arms around herself, waiting for the pain to dissipate, to be overtaken by the promise and the glow. The deceleration whine of the shuttle woke her, along with the voice she loved. Garrus stood and held out her hands, and Jane scrambled to meet them, on her knees, and grateful to be there. Garrus smiled and guided Jane to stand. You are Commander Jane Shepard, my love. Nothing will stop you. You will protect me. Jane smiled and nodded, kissing her, blurred and trembling and grateful to be home. Garrus dropped her hands, her head tilted to gaze at Jane. You are beautiful. You are magnificent. You are courageous. You make me proud to know you. We shall finally see, Jane, what you can do. When you are in doubt, and if we are separated, remember my words. They would not be separated. Confidence surged through her, and she turned to open the shuttle doors, setting her foot down on the vibrating deck of the ship. Her ship. Their ship. She would show Garrus everything, just like she wanted. She turned and saw rushing toward her a Turian. Blue. And in a shocking, jagged, time-dilated moment, she knew his name. Not only did she know his name, she knew what his name meant. One, she had to tell him. Two, she tried to say, Garrus, The words curdled in her throat, choked her. 3, 4. She remembered the pistol at her side and grabbed at it. Garrus's eyes locked on hers in welcome and then alarm, his speed not enough to get to her. She would not fail him. She would not betray him. Thane came into view behind Garrus, and she saw his attention turn to the thing in the shuttle behind her. 5. She held the pistol to her own temple, looked at Garrus's horrified face, and said words she was allowed to say that he would understand from a different context. Saren's last words. Garrus had been there with her, had always been there with her. And now she couldn't be there with him. 6. Goodbye, Shepard. Thank you. 7. She pulled the trigger. Nothing. Yalis had not trusted her with a loaded weapon and had shot Vitkiev simultaneously, making Jane think she'd done it herself. And now she'd failed. She had brought herself and that thing to her family. 8. She dropped the pistol and remembered, was certain, rushing to protect Yalis from Thane. He was the greatest threat. Thane evaded Jane's desperate grab and had almost reached Yalis. Jane surged forward, murderous. Strong arms closed around her. Turian! And Jane struggled, screamed, lunged, and then a blow to her jaw made her slump forward. She was lifted. The last thing she saw causing despair and failure. Thane lunging. Yalis with her pistol out. She woke up screaming, on fire, looking down at her flesh and expecting to see bubbling and burning acid and smoke and blood. Expected to smell the acrid vapors of Thresher Maw burns. But she was whole. She was in the medbay, and Garrus was at her side. She knew that for only as long as it took to think it, and then the searing panic and pain took her again. She's awake. Do something. Morden's voice responded. Could kill her. Addition of more medication, potentially lethal. She didn't see or hear Yalis, and then even her name was gone, distorted, and then vaporized. Garrus tried to hold her head between his hands, and the contact felt like her flesh was going to stick to him and peel off. She screamed again, twisted away as much as she could, which was not far. She was restrained, strapped down, and with the straps dug into her body, where she was struggling against them, the pain was excruciating. Garrus backed away in horror, and she struggled to listen, but she couldn't hear the voice she needed to hear. There was unleashed, frantic pain without the voice that could calm it, control it, bring to her light and purpose. She screamed until she was hoarse, blood choking her breath, eyes tightly closed shut, streaming tears that caused more hot pain on her skin, struggling until coughing broke up the sound, until she fainted. She struggled awake from the clawing dreams. Inescapable oppression, nameless, unable to look behind her, too afraid of what she might see. The clanging habit of guard, being on guard, being aware, alert, took hold. She started to count and made it to 5. Don't make a sound. And then she breathed and dared to crack her eyes open, to look at where she was. Medbay. Normandy. Restrained. Pain from where she was restrained. She wanted to scream. And she remembered waking screaming many times. She experienced surreal disorientation, trying to remember who she was supposed to be right now. Shepard. She reached for more. That's gonna have to be enough. Shepard. Not screaming. Not in the room. Not with Yalis. Bile surged and burned, and she swallowed it back, would not choke or cough, would not make a sound. Garrus was asleep in a chair by the side of her bed, and she saw Dr. Shakwas's back, turned away. Her throat hurt. She had screamed until she had coughed spattered blood, and then screamed more. She closed her eyes and tried to think. She was restrained, and she wanted to hide, to shrink back into the bed, into the covers, until there was nothing left. She counted through the pain. She got to the number 71, much higher than she'd been able to count in a very long time. And then she felt a brief touch on her forearm, and the very familiar and horrifying feel of an injection bit under her skin, and she obediently fell asleep, where she screamed in her dreams. She woke up panicked, struggling against the pain, and heard Garrus say, "Shepard, stop. You have to stop." She was used to following orders, but she did not want to, and rejected it because she could, because she had will and she had strength, and she felt that if her legs were free, she could run. She had screamed sounds, and now she screamed words. "Let me go!" It was Garrus, or someone wanted her to think it was Garrus, but all she cared about was being tied down. His hand came on top of hers, and she flinched away. "Let me go!" His hand moved away, and she did not open her eyes because she didn't want to see that it wasn't him, didn't want to find out that she shouldn't be talking to him, making a demand. "Spirits, what did they do to you?" She responded to the sound of his voice, though her hand jerked at the straps once. Then she held still and listened. Was it a question she should be able to answer? Did she have to answer? How should she answer? A lie. Always a lie. Remember to lie. The sympathy in his voice broke something in her. Something that had disallowed sympathy or pity for herself for so long that its presence baffled her, and then started a flood of remembering. Her lip trembled, and she couldn't stop herself from begging. "Please, please, please, let me go. Please." She felt the strap over her hands release, and some of the pain eased. She'd gotten something she'd asked for. She had something for herself. Something that should not be taken away. Something she deserved and she needed. Something she hadn't gotten for herself in an eternity. But someone had given it to her. She clutched at that tiny bit of potentially retained power and control. It was something simple, and it began an avalanche. She had kept herself from begging, and then she'd forgotten what it was to want something for herself, and now she had the strength to beg and know where to stop. "Please, I won't. Please, please, take them off." Garrus's hand came to hers. It had to be his hand. Talons, and rough hide, and warmth. It had to be him. It couldn't be her. It couldn't be a dream. Please don't let this be a new torture. She felt the urge to throw up, but kept it down. There was nothing in her stomach anyway. She opened one eye and saw him. Opened the other Because it had to be him. She needed it to be him. She begged him to answer her. Am I dead? Did I die? Again? It had been the heartbroken thrum in his voice, the sympathy, and not the command that had drawn her out, made her think that maybe it was true. She was dead. Maybe the gun had worked, and he'd held a ghost. Maybe she'd done her job. Please, Garrus, tell me I'm dead. But if you're here, Garrus, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. He didn't know how to answer that. And she saw that, his indecision, his broken heart. Things she'd only thought belonged to her for what seemed like an eternity. Maybe this was heaven. Garrus, please, let me go. I can't. You can't keep me tied down. You can't. I can't. He looked at her, and he saw her, made a decision. One he wasn't sure about, but he saw her. He leaned over and released the last of the restraints, and she was free. She counted to herself. 1, 2, 3, 4. He looked at her as though she was about to kill him, and maybe she was. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. She said aloud, cramped, terrified muscles relaxing on the exhalation of the breath used to say it. 10. Garrus watched her, broken and horrified. 10 what? She calmed. She had just experienced a miracle. She told him. Just 10. She held onto his hand. He held onto hers. Her hand burned, felt like it was bubbling from the contact. But she didn't want to let go. Dr. Shakwas came over, and although Jane recognized her and didn't think she meant harm, she reacted to the sight of the needle. She jerked her hand back. No more. Nothing under my skin. No, don't put me back down. I can't stop screaming, please. Karen froze. She took a step back and held up her hands. She had nasty bruises under her forearms. Jane pressed her lips together. I did that. Yes, but you did not mean to do that. I did that. Jane fatalistically accepted that she brought harm back to her ship. She'd had one job, and she had failed. Then Jane remembered. Where is she? Where is it, that thing? I brought it with me. Maybe right now isn't. Where is it? Karen took another step back, and Jane's head swung wildly, expecting to see her through the glass in the hall, coming to get her. She'd fucking get her right back. She's not here. She's not on the ship. Jane swung her head to look at him. "Where is it?" She did sound as though she was about to kill him. She struggled to get up, to go look, and he hesitated, but he put his hands on her shoulders. Instant fire on her skin and fury at being touched. She went absolutely wild, striking out, but Garrus's arms were much longer than hers, and he was prepared. And she couldn't do any harm to his exoskeleton, mostly flailing, until he trapped her arms. "Jane, stop." She froze, followed the command instantly, and then she was infuriated, cowed, and sick at once. He looked at her face, pain and uncertainty on his features. He was trying to look for her, for what he'd seen when he took off her restraints, for a reason to stop restraining her. She tried to be that reason, struggled to provide him with less avalanche, less crazy. He released her shoulders and took a step back, his hands up in attempted truce, his eyes begging her to compromise. She repeated, "Where is it?" "She's gone. Thane took her in the shuttlecraft you came in. Thane knocked her out. He was in control. He told Edie he was going to go back and track her origin point through the shuttle's navigation system to find out where you were, if anybody was left." Her lip trembled. Everything scary about Yalis was scary about Thane. And Thane had her restrained before he left. There's nobody left there. Not alive. How long was I gone? 7 weeks. She set her jaw. How long have I been here? 2 weeks. And Thane has been gone those 2 weeks? He's not back? And you haven't heard from him since? After the first few days, Edie got what she thinks is a ping, a confirmation from him that he is alive. It's a small data burst, but it arrives on the same time cycle, marking midnight on Rakana. It's relayed through an automated repeating service on the Citadel, sending a picture of a black chess piece. A knight, she said. She thinks he's got nothing but his Omni-tool, and is unable to communicate directly without drawing attention to himself, unwilling to use any technology on the shuttle or wherever you were. With it timed, she thinks he might have set up a dead man's switch. The message will stop sending if he does not authorize it each day. So all he has to do is send a binary switch authorization to the Citadel remotely. A tiny communication transaction. Impossible to track without having the encryption key. She thinks he wants us to know he's still alive, and that he won't give away the Normandy's location, and that he can't give away his. There's no directionality and no way to respond. Jane, he had her down. He had her out. Thane knew immediately that she was a threat, and he had her off the ship before I got you to the medbay. He did not consult with me. He made his own decision, and I understand why he did it. We had been looking for you for 7 weeks. He took his chance to get answers and to get her off the ship before she could do any damage. I have faith he can take care of himself, that he's alive. A chess piece. A knight. Symbols were important. Everyone else is okay? Did I hurt anybody else? No, you haven't hurt anybody else. And you've only hurt us because you're in pain. I understood your message. I understood you were indoctrinated. With anybody else, they probably wouldn't have found it, but you've been brought back to life, cell by cell. There are years of full body scans for reference, all familiar to Miranda. She was able to find it. She swallowed. Find what? But she knew. Whatever it was that wrapped around her brain, it wasn't drugs or drill assassin venom. Whatever it was that only allowed her 7 seconds of thought and froze all repeated rebellious actions. Nerve tissue, protected by an altered myelin sheath that generates a variety of psychoactive agents. It is undetectable on a scan unless you know exactly what you are looking for, because our technology shows it as normal tissue. Miranda and Morden, in consultation with Amalis Chemi, found it. It was enmeshed in your nervous system, hooked into pain and pleasure centers. No shit. Garrus choked on a laugh. And then so did she. And then she coughed and laughed for the first time in 9 weeks. Out loud. Garrus's shoulders dropped. There is bad news, though. They removed it, but it continues to try to regrow, to recolonize, and to target those locations. They've developed a preliminary inhibitor to keep it from spreading, but it's in your system. We don't know the delivery method. It may always be there. She jerked her hand back. Don't touch me. You'll fuck Garrus. Put me in the brig. Why am I am fucking ordering you to get me into isolation. No. You need to stay in the med bay. They just got you back to coherence, unhooking Reaper biological technology from your brain and helping damaged brain heal. Say thank you. Thank you. Hurt like hell. Put me in the frickin' brig. No. They will develop another inhibitor. They're working on some sort of contrast to highlight the areas. They know the growth rates. You're safe. You're only trying to kill me because you're stubborn and mean, not because you're indoctrinated. For now, they have... Would you explain it, Karen? We've isolated where on your spine the matrix aggregates. Removal results in regrowth. We don't know the source. It could be deep inside your spinal cord. It could be in your blood, your lymphatics. We don't know. It likely mimics some other normal process, and we don't know what we're looking for or where to look. After the first extraction, there was recolonization within hours. Instead of repeating the process, we've had to calcify the area. Sometimes when your body finds something it can't eliminate, it may form a shell around it, and business goes on as usual. The body ignores it as bone surface. We provided a simulated shell. As an analogy, the seed is there, but it can't get water or sunlight, has no space to grow, can't find what it needs to germinate. We can't extract it from your spinal cord. It would recolonize, and you would eventually have no spinal cord left if that was the method used to remove it. You need your spinal cord, Jane. For now, we inhibit it until we come up with another solution. These are stopgap measures, the same way we began with Thane's Capral syndrome. We're not there yet, but we will get there. We know the location, We don't see any other parts of your body where the matrix aggregates. It is targeted and doesn't adapt to different locations on the spine or in the brain. That is good. That will make it possible to monitor on scans, to inhibit, to control. We can watch to see if the calcification integrity is lost. With the preliminary inhibitor, Karen held up the syringe as evidence. You need to have it, Jane. I appreciate you not wanting a needle, but consider this is a greater preventive than the brig. It's a miracle. It's going to inhibit that growth while still allowing your brain to carry on its normal function, still repair itself. That seemed impossible a week ago. We've seen miracles in this room, and we need to keep on seeing them. You are not in any immediate danger. It would take weeks for the matrix to regrow fully and reattach to a brain site. In the meantime, if it does grow, and it hasn't for days, we would be able to trim it back indefinitely with no further trauma to your spine or brain. We believe the beds are calcified and the matrix will be unable to expand. We're trying to find a way to provoke an immune response. Garrus interjected. A response that won't kill you. Yes, ideally, that won't kill you. Jane, in an effort that had her panting and sweating, held out her arm to take the shot. When that was done, she wanted to stand, wanted to run, jumped down on free, healthy feet, and then tried to think of an explanation to justify doing that, something other than mindless panic. I'm reporting to the brig. Garrus dropped his head and shook it in defeat. Fine. I'm going with you. Fine. She moved her feet because she could. She looked at the deck because she could. She could bend her neck. Her feet burned from contact with the deck, but she was free. She didn't want to say anything about the pain. Karen would make her lie back down, and Jane would try to kill her, because no way in hell. She'd take the pain, along with the freedom. Though she was about to lock herself up until she was sure she wasn't a threat. She didn't feel like a threat. And she did know what being an indoctrinated threat felt like, but who the fuck really knew? Wasn't there such a thing as post-hypnotic suggestion? Triggers? Could they kick in? Was the damage permanent? Was she gonna be this crazy? Forever? Considering they'd ripped things out of her drug-addled brain and scraped things off her spinal cord, and then put them in calcium jail? Karen responded. I'll set up a monitoring station there. Jane, with her bare feet on the vibrating deck, paused, smiled, and said, Fine. It's a party. She turned to look at Karen. Wait a minute. Do you think we could find this in other people? Garrus answered. They found it in Dr. Kenson. They're working on removing it based on Morden's recommendations. They've found it in other people. Everyone on the Bahak Systems station, terrifyingly also those in active duty, all over the place. They're working on how to remove it from their systems, to synthesize the inhibitor, to calcify and isolate the regions involved. We've forwarded the basics and methods to governments, news organizations, and medical organizations. Everyone on the Normandy has been scanned. We're all clean. So that's good? That's good? She tasted the word good. It was foreign, implausible. Garrus picked her up and she was immediately stiff, terrified, shaky, 99% ready to demand that he put her down, to scream and to hit him because it felt like restraint, and everywhere he touched her burned. But she had to control herself. She counted to 10, relishing the 8, decided it was now her favorite number, her lucky number. And she looked at his face, remembered his voice, saw that he was 99% something that was not ready to laugh or explain, or let her leave this room under any circumstances, and he was trying to control himself. She tried to reach for hope, but although her feet could run, hope was out of reach of her hands or her mind. She needed the discipline it took to prove that she wasn't broken, even though she knew she was. She might really be permanently broken, and she'd have to tell them if that were true. Just not right now. It would take time, and she would try not to hurt people, or scream, or cry, or hide, she thought, as she was being carried to the brig, as she worried about a biofilm forming on Garrus's skin, soaking in through his hide and plates from contact with her, as she wondered if it was there already from holding her hand for 2 weeks while she screamed herself awake and in her sleep, while he wondered if she would ever wake up or stop screaming. She was sure he had agonized, was agonizing about whether his commander, the woman he loved, was still in there, or capable of command, and that he had 2 weeks of experience agonizing over whether Thane was alive, whether he could have stopped him or helped him. Garrus carried her into a brig cell, set his omni-tool, and activated the security screen. She felt better, inexplicably, in a room with a door she couldn't escape. It was sick and terrible, and she wanted to cry and hit the walls, pound against the screen until her fists bled, but she kept it in. Garrus stepped to the back of the cell, ignored the utilitarian bed, leaned against the wall and slid slowly to the floor, hunched in and around her, his mournful, grieving keen filling the space, her tears sliding down her cheeks in burning trails. His arms were wrapped around her tightly, and she tried to focus as pain and revulsion crawled over her skin. She tried to remember what it was like when she thought of his plates as comfort, thought of his voice as courage. Her skin would heal. She had to believe that. This was an after effect. Her pain perception was royally fucked and fondued. It seemed like for a while skin contact was going to feel like thresher malt acid to a greater or lesser degree. It was now lesser. She had screamed herself unconscious when it was greater. Now it was tenderness and pain like a severe sunburn, but no longer feeling like her flesh was melting off. She could do this. She couldn't bear to push him away, to have him think she didn't want him to touch her. But But she didn't want him to touch her. She kept the screams in. She didn't want anybody to touch her. He had more courage than she had. He'd locked himself in with a woman who, 2 weeks ago, was indoctrinated, drugged, and hypnotized, and minutes ago was begging, hitting, screaming. With a woman who was trying not to kill people and run away. She understood the Keenan he made. Wanted to be able to make it herself, but she was quiet, stiff, and fearful. Waiting. The true horror of realizing, not in flashes or bits or occasionally, that Yalis was a Drell assassin, hit her. She almost threw up, but according to her long-held habits, held still, controlled her reactions, consciously relaxed, like all those times she had pretended to be asleep, pretended to faint. Garrus's arms loosened around her, just a little, and she sighed as some of the pain faded. She listened, finding communion in every sound he made. And after his Keenan stopped, she listened to his breathing. She didn't know if Thane was alive. She didn't know if she would ever allow him to touch her again if he was. She reached for Garrus's hand, spread 3 fingers over the glowing light on his wrist, ignored the burning, closed her eyes, and tried to think that she didn't have to think. She had a hero's example to live up to. She counted. She breathed.